So I'm going to be speaking on the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. It's quite different to Andrew's talk that we saw last night. And I've been working with JJ Ainsworth, who's an American researcher, and she focuses on ancient symbolism. That's her kind of expertise. She's got a real eye for this kind of stuff. She's also my partner. We also travel a lot. We also go to these sites. We discovered the Karahan Tepe alignment that occurred on the winter solstice last year, and she'll be up for the second half of the talk. So I'm going to just crack into the first half of the talk, which I'll be more focused on more of the more unusual aspects. I'm going to be writing a small wooden book on this subject as well, and this is part of the preliminary research of where we've got to with that. It's also mentioned that we're going to be going to ancient Turkey, Anatolia, in September. And Andrew's just arrived here. How you doing? And we're going to be exploring all these sites and much, much more all across the whole area of Turkey. Details on the flyer anyway. And the title of the talk is Geometry of the Goddess at Göbekli Tepe and Beyond. And I'm going to start looking more at the technical side of it and some of the research myself. I've been working along with Adam Tetlow and John Martineau, looking at the geometry and metrology and some of the alignments as well. Some of it follows on from Andrew's research as well. And nowadays, this area is called the Tastepala region. And this really is a series of officially 12 sites, all kind of centered around Göbekli Tepe. But there's sites that are further afield, like Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tala, which are actually older than Göbekli Tepe, but they don't have the same kind of sophistication in the stonework, but they do have some elements of that. But I first went there in 2013 with Andrew and Graham Hancock. It was actually Graham's first time there, and I was absolutely blown away when we got there, because it didn't really have a roof on it then, but now it's got this roof you can see on the bottom left here, which kind of covers everything up, so you can't really you can get a really good sense of it if they often take these kind of covers off, so you get a good light on it, and it's quite remarkable even today. But when we were there, you were able to kind of walk around this wooden platform throughout the site. As you know, Göbekli Tepe goes back to at least 9,600 BC, 11,600 years old. But Klaus Schmidt, when we were there, when I was with Andrew, he actually said it could be much older. There was evidence of that. This is just another map of the region, and it gives you some of the sites that are further afield, like Karahan Tepe and Gusi Hoyak, Kayuni, which I know Andrew's been to way back in 2004. Kisilik as well, they're not sure where that is, but they found an interesting statue there. And also, and you can see that the way some of these earlier sites like Karahan Tepe and also Göbekli Tala in this area near Mardin actually go back a bit before Göbekli Tepe along the Tigris River, whereas most of the Göbekli Tepe sites in Karahan and all this kind of stuff are more around the Euphrates area. And you can just see there's when we sort of saw this map, myself and John Martin, we kind of got slightly excited because we thought there might be some geodesy, some connections between these sites. And we've started looking at that. Well, first of all, there's a site called Karahan Tepe, which is really interesting. This goes back to 10,500 BC. So this is nearly 1,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. And what we've got here, not only we've got some interesting enclosures, you've also got evidence that this was a hunter-gatherer community. They weren't growing crops or anything, so it hadn't developed by then. This is one of the amazing pieces where we see some of the first signs in this area of 3D stone relief carving, but these are on like small-sized rocks. Also, there's serpents and other things carved at this site. Göbekli Tala, this is slightly older than Göbekli Tepe. This is 10,000 BC, and this is there's 30 residential houses here. There's some of the first examples of monoliths inside this time square enclosures. And what's really interesting when I came across this photo is you've got this portal stone here, which probably was a circular portal, much like we find at Göbekli Tepe and now at Karahan Tepe. And there's been much jewelry, small artifacts, very beautiful pieces have actually been found here, even though this was supposed to be before kind of the agricultural revolution where crops and other civilization really began. Obviously, Göbekli Tepe is the site. It's a huge site. This is kind of, what it would have looked like before it was excavated back in the 90s. And this is one of the first discoveries, was this stone here, this top of a T-pillar that was found and actually found up on the area. It was first investigated back in 1963, but it wasn't really until Klaus Schmidt arrived in the 90s that it really became a proper excavation site. But even so, he started working on another site before he even started on this, because he knew it would take the rest of his life to do so. This is just what some of the enclosures look like from above. This is good, an early photo. These are the main enclosures in the southeast corner that have been investigated. And this is pretty big. You'll see how big this is in a moment when I show you a photo of JJ standing next to it. But just to give you a sense of scale, you've got a couple of people, I think, standing in there. And the fact that most of the site has not been excavated, we can see what we're looking at here. And this is the scan, one of the early scans that was done in the early 2000s. And it shows you the vastness of the site. So we've got these quite large enclosures. These are 60, 70 feet wide in some cases. But you've got things like this that have yet to be excavated. These actually look even bigger, possibly. So what else might be unearthed is going to be very, very interesting. It actually covers 9 hectares, or 22 acres in total. This is a recent reconstruction. Just shows you a possible roof. Some of it has terrazzo floors on it, which is like a kind of, almost like a conglomerate, a type of almost like cement, geopolymer perhaps. These are representations of what they think some of the smaller buildings above the enclosures would have looked like. And they now think these are domestic enclosures, but also used ceremonially. Enclosure D is obviously the most impressive part of the site. It's this one here. You've got these huge T-pillars in the centre. I'm not going to repeat too much, Andrew. Most of you know about Göbekli Tepe. This is what it looks like now. And this is how big it is. This is what I call Enclosure JJ when she's in the photo. But this is actually in the wrong place, isn't it, Andrew? It should be here. It should be in the centre. But it just shows you the scale of what we're dealing with here. But I'm just fascinated by what Andrew and Rodney Hale have put the idea of this elliptical geometry. And this kind of got me thinking and working with John and Adam about, if there's elliptical geometry, is there more geometry here? Is there other stuff going on as well? Is there other things happening? We also spotted this when we were doing our research. We found some acoustic experiments were done, I think in the early 2000s by Paolo de Botolis of the University of Trieste, and he found some interesting acoustics. He even got to a point where, when he was knocking on pillar 18, one of the central pillars, he thought it was hollow in some cases, and it would hum when wind blew through it, almost like the shallow pits they sit in were partly designed for this. He also found resonances and harmonics of 91 hertz to 138 hertz, which is close to the basic musical fifth, amongst other things. So this backs up the idea, as Andrew and Rodney have found, that these are acoustic enclosures. They're not just for ceremony and things like this. While they were there, they also found a magnetic field, which I found very interesting. They recorded this on various equipment, right in the centre between the 2 main pillars of Enclosure D. And they managed to photograph this as well. Now this fascinates me because this could be relevant. It could have been why the site was chosen, why this specific spot was chosen. It could have been a site used a lot earlier than this. And this is kind of their final analysis of what it may have looked like. But often these magnetic fields do move around, and sometimes in spiral motifs, which is what they discovered, almost like serpents. And that makes me wonder if the serpent carvings we find all over the site may have maybe something to do with that. It might be give you some kind of altered state, and it would cause this. And we find the serpent, kind of rising serpent symbolism all over the planet, from Saqqara in Egypt, Gigantia, Malta and Gozo, Göbekli Tepe, and the symbol of Enki here on the left. This is, as Andrew mentioned yesterday, the work of Avi Gopher, who did some analysis of the geometry found at equilateral triangle between the 3 enclosures by finding the centres of each enclosure based upon the surrounding wall. And he did this on each of the 3 main enclosures there. And then a good friend, Adam Tetler, who's a master geometer and metrologist, he found that these alignments here, he got the exact measurements of these and found some very interesting numbers popping out, as though it was based upon the traditional canon of ancient measurement, which really surprised him when he first noted this. He found not only the British foot, the Sumerian foot, the Royal Egyptian cubit, all within these measurements. Here's just a close-up of some of the discoveries here. And he drew circles, he did the sort of geometer's thing around the site. He found the distance between two of the centres was 60 Persian feet. He got 50 Sumerian feet for the height of the triangle. You also got 200 Sumerian palms, and the circumference is 200 Royal Egyptian feet, which absolutely surprised me, to quite a level. And it made me wonder if there's more going on here, and maybe is this the origin of some of these measures which are based on the circumference and shape of the Earth. Therefore, is this the site, the area where this all began, the Earth measurement? We're still working on the Navali Churi, but clearly this is a very interesting shape and size. But the corners are pretty much exactly north-south, so we're certainly working with that. This is a site that's now been flooded, so you can't really go there. So what we decided to do, see if any of the British stone circles, any of Alexander Thom's geometries, and any of his measurements, that although we found it very difficult to get hold of any measurements for Göbekli Tepe, we haven't been able to get the accurate survey from anywhere pretty much. We've had to sort of try and decode it ourselves. But we thought we'd apply, because we're all megalithomaniacs, we're obsessed by people like John Michel and Robin Heath and Alexander Thom. We'd see if any of these geometries and shapes occur in any of these sites in the area. Now this is quite speculative. We're just very early stage of this area of research. But we wanted to show you this and get feedback on it as well, because we think it's quite interesting when you start looking at this. He came up with multiple different geometries. He found in about 300 stone circles that he surveyed, not just in Britain, but also in Brittany, but all over Scotland, Callanish, Orkney, and everywhere else. So this is speculative. So we're not suggesting this is how it is, but we found this interesting when we started applying some of these to Göbekli Tepe. So we've got this egg-shaped circle type 1 on Enclosure D. Now, this doesn't fit precisely, but it is quite an interesting fit, because some of these, what we found, this is the new research of Lee Clare, is that there's much like pushing in of the enclosures from debris that he says fell into the area from the above buildings, as some of the stones kind of get pushed in. Now this particular geometry is quite rare in Britain. There's only 10 or 12 or so circles with this particular geometry, but I think it's a fairly good fit. And it also fits with the ellipse theory that Andrew and Rodney have come up with as well. We're just putting another perspective on this. And what have we got here there? Because this is interesting, because this also encodes 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triangles as well. And the 3, 4, 5 is something that the ellipses, some of those occur in as well. And here are some examples where we find this in Britain, or similar ones, slight variations. Allan Water, the 12 Apostles up north, and Clava as well. But most interestingly, this geometry is also what we find at Nabta Playa in Egypt, which could be up to 7,500 BC in some cases. Generally, it's thought to be around 5,000 BC. And so that we thought was really interesting. Again, we need to do a bit more research. The size of it, the exact dimensions, is what we're still trying to get. We've got lots of approximates. We've got 5 variations of the size of each of the enclosures at the moment. So we can't really work with that. We need to get the exact. We might take a measuring tape to the museum where they've got the reconstruction. We also found this with Enclosure C, a flattened circle modified type B. We thought this was a much better fit. And you can see here, you've actually got the bench, the shape of the bench in between the stones fits quite well. You've also got the construction points of certain angles, as though you're using rope or string, are actually right pretty much in the centre of where the T-pillars are located as well. So we found that quite a good fit. And it also aligns nicely with, I believe, the hold stone and the possible entrance at this end as well, which leads down to the Dromos, which is like an avenue kind of leading into this part of the construction. That's just a close-up of it there. This is the inner circle. There's another circle, an outer circle, which is harder to work with because there's less stones and they've been moved around more. They're kind of leaning inwards and outwards a little bit. But yeah, we found this quite interesting and we thought that was quite a good fit. But again, more neat research needs to be done on this. This is the flattened circle type D. This is enclosure A. This one we're not so sure about because some of the stones are still missing. But because you've got this stone here, we found this quite interesting. And these ones fit on this side of it. It's not a circle though, we checked a circle on all these as well, but they don't really fit. But yeah, so we think this one is probably the most impressive one. And if this is the case, then this opens up a whole possibility of where the origins of the stone circle designs in Britain may have emerged. And we find examples of enclosure A and this one here. We do find a few examples in Britain up in Cumbria where we get the same kind of geometry. This is what they all look like together. So we found this, quite an interesting study. We're just looking for the measurements now. We're waiting, we're searching. We're going to have to harass the actual archaeologists who don't like me and Andrew very much. So we might have to get JJ to do it or something, see if we can get the exact numbers. But it really did make me think, what on earth is going on with the rest of the site then? Because if we find more examples like this, this looks a bit like this geometry here, but the other way up. We thought that was interesting here. But again, we don't know until they excavate it, if they ever excavate it at all. But all three of these geometries are found up on the Outer Hebrides, for instance, which we thought, again, was quite intriguing, to say the least, in the various Callanish stone circles. So Karahan Tepe, this is equally an important site, quite possibly. Not as big as Göbekli Tepe, as you saw from the scan, but there's a lot going on here. This is our good friend Kevin Fish, who came with us a few years ago. Like Andrew said, this is what it looked like before. This is a reconstruction that's been recently created by an artist. And they believe there was a roof over the main enclosure. We're not so sure. They think that at Göbekli Tepe as well, because the thing about Göbekli Tepe, the stones are so well preserved there, it seems like it must have had a roof at least at some point. Whereas at Karahan, as Andrew said, the stones are kind of ruined, they're damaged. Now you've got the enclosure, the pillar shrine back here, you've got all the other things up here. But I think that's quite a nice image of, a kind of the site kind of being partly constructed way back when. And we'll come on to, JJ's going to come on to the sort of more goddess area of this, because actually one of the things that Andrew came up with, which I'm going to just mention, is that in northern Kurdish, the name, I think Keçli, can translate as girl, daughter, maiden, occasionally any woman, or even queen. So it may have a connection with this goddess kind of thing, which JJ is going to get into. But we had a look at the geometry here, and we do agree with Andrew and Rodney that certainly it's got an elliptical design, but we thought we'd try and apply some geometries to it anyway and see if we came up with anything. We came up with one which is a near fit, which is this one here, which is a bit of a mouthful, an egg-shaped circle with semi-elliptical end type 3. I need you to remember this. And this kind of fits. It doesn't fit precisely, but it kind of fits. But it's also, it would work as an acoustic ellipse as well. So yeah, we found this intriguing. It's not as nice a fit as the one we saw at Göbekli Tepe. But again, if we can get the measurements to back this up, then it will fit. It can fit, but until we know the exact measurements, we're speculating. This is why I kind of announced at the very start of the talk, this is a preliminary research kind of investigation we just wanted to share with you. But yeah, while we were there on December the 20th last year, as Andrew's talked about, we spotted, JJ actually spotted this first. I was busy rushing around like a kid in a toy shop, getting photographs and filming everything. We noticed this sort of beam of light on the side of the head about 45 minutes after sunrise in this really strange pillar shrine or enclosure AB. And it was coming through this portal here, hit the side here, and it moved along the side of the head, sort of downwards across the lower part of the face. This is kind of the angle it would have come in at. It would have, firstly, it could have gone between the two pillars when they were standing. It may have just beamed through in between the two pillars when they were standing, through the hole into this spot here, through here and hitting this. I mean, it looks like a bit of a mess at the moment, but much of this probably wasn't here originally. But it's the area where the sunrise happens to the east is kind of open. There's no walls, there's nothing in the way. So clear, and even the benches, the kind of buttresses with the thrones, they're facing towards this area as well, almost like they're just waiting for the sunrise when they're in the enclosure. After a while, after about an hour and a half, after the sun had risen above this and was now shining down here rather than through here, a halo of light occurred around the head. So the top part of the head we found very, very interesting. We thought that was odd, you know, because was that part of the design, or was this just a coincidence? But another thing that I've got to credit Andrew again is one of the stories collected from the local families there was that it was also known as the bald place or the bald head or something like this. And so this is like almost like a representation of a bald person protruding from the thing. And we thought there's almost like there's different meanings from different traditions, different areas, different Kurdish or Turkish that kind of have different meanings. So, and also I found this very interesting because I started to look into the way they would create measurements in different parts of the world. And this looked to me, it looks almost a bit like one of these, the Folkestone drums or the Burton Agnes drum, the most recently discovered one. And it made me question if they were wrapping string around certain stones, and the stones actually encoded the measurements they were using. This is certainly the case with these that were found in northern England. Whether that was happening around the head sticking out the wall at Karahan, we don't know. But I think it may have been, if we start looking at some of the statues, some of the other pieces at these sites, there may be a clue that this may have been happening. So these were found up north. They date back to the Bronze Age. The Folkestone ones are the most famous, and the Burton Agnes one is the most recently discovered. These are all on display now at the British Museum Stonehenge exhibition. But they found, and this is actually an academic paper that was put out about this, if you wrap string around the perimeter, the top part of this, one of them, it equals 12.7 inches or 32.2 centimetres, which is, they call it a long foot, but it's also the Persian foot. This is the same Persian foot we found at Göbekli Tepe in between the three centres of the site. So this is, and obviously Persian, this is the area almost that we're talking about here. They found there are different ways you could wrap the string around different parts of the drum. They found another measurement of 3.22 metres, which they found within Stonehenge as well. But I found this kind of intrigued me, because if they're going to create objects like this and use them as measurements tools to measure a certain length of foot, then this opens up a whole possibility of all what these different statues may mean. We also found this as well. That this is actually someone posted this a while back on our Facebook group, and they found a golden section or the phi ratio within some of the stones. You can see that here, 1 to 1.618, and the belt is the point there. And this one here, this one's not so accurate because it could go lower down than this, but again we're finding that here. And they found it on a few other of the statues as well. And so there's a possible recording of the golden section within some of the stones at Göbekli Tepe. And I believe that with the research that myself and JJ especially has done on the tradition of the giantess and the apronful, where we found all these stories about the strings as she was striding across the landscape from one site to another. We get this in Malta, we get this in Britain and other places. She would choose one site to start from, have another site she was going to finish at, and would stride across the landscape in a dead straight line, and suddenly the strings would break on the apron, stones would fall out and create an ancient site. And this was like Gigantia was formed like this, the Barclodigad de Gowers up in Wales, which means the giantess's apronful. And JJ realised that if you translate apron into Old Latin, it comes out as the word mapper or map. And so it seems like, and the strings and knots would break at specific times. So it was encoding information within this apron. And this is something that has become a tradition with the Freemasons as well in different secret societies, that they can code things within the apron and sew things into them. And so are the belts here a similar thing? You know, are they kind of a belt that would have the measurement within them? Even this, the pelt that hangs down, is that actually an apron? Is this something people maybe haven't spotted before? And the measurements of it would encode the information required to lay out these sites and be a surveyor. Because JJ believes that the first surveyors were females, and this was where it all kind of began, when you start going back into these very early goddess traditions, which she'll talk about herself, of course. And so if you've got that going on there, then obviously the work that Andrew's done on the astronomy kind of fits in. You've got the layout of the sites to one another. There may be some information there. We've done some research on the measurements, the distances between the sites, which I'll share with you in a moment. But I think these sites were also memory spaces where they were recording all their culture's information in one place. They weren't just ceremonial. They weren't just for artistic, you know, showing off, things like that. They weren't just for performance. They were for other things. And I think one of these was to record all the most important information. I think that's why they deliberately had to preserve the site so well by probably putting a roof over it soon after they constructed it, after they'd done all the astronomical alignments, and then completely covering it over and repairing it under a huge mound at the end of its use, a couple of thousand years after it was created. Perhaps they were worried about cataclysms coming because this was created just after the Younger Dryas. Maybe it was done because there was different cultures coming in and they were threatening them, and so they covered it up and hid it as a time capsule for future generations. Whatever it was, they did it and they preserved it, and we're here. We're trying to all decode it now. One of the other things we find is these portal stones, but also the cut marks, which really interest me and JJ, because this is the origins. This is the first real place where they had cut marks or cupules, which for a long time were thought to be water collectors, but according to Maria Gimbutas and JJ's continuing research, there's whole other dimensions to these regarding the goddess and collecting sacred water and used ceremonies and other such things. But interestingly, we find potential cut marks, which surprised me, at Stonehenge on top of one of the pillars. And these aren't just mortise, they're the mortise and sort of tenon joints that are represented here. But these, what are these? There's all these little things here. So we're finding them on top of the pillars here, and later on top of these pillars as well. So there is kind of evidence, although it's some time after the time of Göbekli Tepe, of DNA origins in certain parts of Anatolia, reaching Britain and Ireland in these two reports here, going back a few thousand years BC. But Stonehenge, there are odd little connections which I'd just like to share with you. One of these is the fact that if you draw a line from the centre of Enclosure D to the centre of Stonehenge, it's 2,205 miles. Now, that might not mean much, but when Adam Tetlow kind of worked it out, it's exactly 1 million Persian feet, which is the same Persian foot we saw inside Göbekli Tepe as well. We don't find the Persian foot in Stonehenge though, oddly, but we find it in the distance between it and Göbekli Tepe. It's also just a speculative idea that these post holes that were there, these are actually 10,000 years old. So is this an indication that they were starting a survey at the time of, towards the end of the Göbekli Tepe kind of era, going more into like the 8,000 BC? Were they spreading out? Were they measuring the sites on a worldwide scale? This is wild speculation, but I think it's interesting to consider. And so, but there's a lot of possibilities going on with this. One of the fun ideas is that we actually talk about in our Giants book is that, you know, and Andrew has talked about this at length. You know, is this the whole story of Enoch in the book of Enoch, where he's taken by the watchers or angels and he takes strings and chords, goes off to measure? You know, are the chords about, is the measurement, and the stories they're talking about going to these high northern latitudes or British type weather with all this happening? Again, I don't want to go into it too much now, but it's just an idea that there might be some more reality to this, the more we find evidence of these measures and geometries and other such things. Got an interesting Göbekli Tepe Easter Island connection here. Obviously the hands are very intriguing, very similar, both going towards the navel. This is a classic thing Andrew, Graham Hancock, others have talked about. Göbekli Tepe kind of means navel hill, as does Easter Island, and we believe that's I believe that's the beginning of a survey point. You start at the navel and you go from there, and Göbekli Tepe was no doubt the first one. And interestingly, if you draw a line from Göbekli Tepe, middle of Enclosure D, to the middle of Easter Island, it's 55 million English feet exactly, which, you know, that can vary slightly because Easter Island's, you know, quite big. But we thought that was odd if you just aim for the centre of the island. Even, this is something I found in 2014, a few years ago. If you draw a line between Göbekli Tepe again, Enclosure D, and the Coricancha in Peru, which is another naval site, pre-Incan site, you get 7,928 miles, which is the exact Earth's diameter at the equator as well. And the canonical number is 7920, which is 8 times 9 times 10 times 11. And we find similar carvings. You know, this is Göbekli Tepe, this one here and this one here. This is Peru. This is Silistani and Cotimbo. Very, very oddly similar. Something that we've all noted before. If you were to draw a line between Göbekli Tepe and Jericho, it's 2 million Saxon feet, or 2,200,000 English feet. And the ratio between them is 11 to 10. If we draw a line from Göbekli Tepe to Nam Madol, it's exactly 7,500 miles, which is 39,600,000 feet. 3960 miles is the radius of the Earth. If we draw a line from Göbekli Tepe to Delphi, we have 900 miles exactly, and this is 5 million Samian feet. And so we find all these strange correlations between these sites. Now, again, we're just throwing this out there at the moment. We've got a lot more work to do, but we wanted to just present what we had so far. I think there's a few other ideas are brewing with this, but we're not kind of ready to kind of present that just yet. But we feel there's something going on here, and I think there's much more going on here than meets the eye. And it's thanks to people like Andrew, Klaus Schmidt, and others who've been pushing forward with this research and has enabled it to be sort of put out into the public in a very profound way. It's not just because the modern archaeologists working there, they're not open to many of these ideas. They're not very keen on it even getting out there, as we experienced firsthand when we were there last time. But we're going to keep doing it, keep researching, not just this, but other sites in the area as well, because there's 12 other sites that are still being excavated. There are potentially 30 in the area. And as Andrew said, this is a civilization we're dealing with here, of a much earlier epoch than people realize. So again, obviously you can join us there in September. Hopefully some of the other sites are going to be open. There's been new discoveries of giant underground complexes there near Mardin, similar to Derinkuyu. We're going to see what we can visit. We know Göbekli and Karahan are open in that area, and a few other places, and the museum is remarkable. But we're going to wait in September. Some of the sites, the early sites, might also be available. So that's my part of the talk done. I thank you very much, and we're going to now get JJ up to the stage, and she's going to continue.